supervisor gave me. The first was to learn about production scheduling through actually doing production scheduling for them for their circuit card assemblies. The second thing she wanted me to really learn was to look at how to look at the current material stoppages, as well as how to analyze the root causes behind these stoppages so that they could understand what's going on and hopefully make improvements. And the last thing they see me learn was how their physical inventory is completed and done, and how essentially I can participate through it. So just one of the main things I worked on was SMT scheduling. So just to give a background on it, it stands for solder mount technology. So Honeywell actually produces their circuit card assemblies, and their circuit card assemblies go into upper level builds for missiles, surface, and ground technologies. So I was essentially running the very first and start of their circuit card assemblies, and they let me do this by myself towards the end of the internship. I was actually running the whole production floor for that. So I broke down this into 3 main parts just because scheduling takes so long to do. It takes 3 days just to build a schedule and then the whole week to execute it. So the first thing that I did every single week was I asked, what can I build? And this seems like it would be a simple question, but it's definitely not. I actually used SAP, which is an enterprise resource planning system, and I would pull something called a CUIS. And the CUIS essentially showed all the different assemblies and the demand, so the past due for these assemblies, the demand for the next coming weeks, and just sort of gave me a huge picture about what needed to be produced in order for us to meet the revenue for that month. Once I looked at all the different assemblies, I then had to understand what I could actually build. So we at Honeywell have something called the stoppage reports. The stoppage report lists all the different missing parts, what assemblies they go on, what top levels they go on, when we expect to get these missing parts in, and essentially where they're placed. Because for me, when the circuit card assemblies, we have SMT, which is the first stage, and then they finish them in another plant. If they're placed at SMT, there's no way I can build it. If it's placed at the other plant, there's a possibility I could still build it, but I have to decide, do I want it sitting there in the plant, or do I just not want to build it at all? So once I kind of went through and marked which ones in red, there was no possible way that I could build those. And I would list the missing part, when it was due in, where it was placed, any related comments towards it. Once I marked which ones there was no way I could build, I then had to go through each remaining build and see if I could even build those. So I would go into SAP, I'd plug in the demand, and then I would look and see, okay, so this assembly, it would pop out kind of like a missing parts list, and you had to go through each one because it wasn't always accurate as to if it was actually missing a part or not. And I would go forward and I would say, okay, I have this quantity, maybe I need some more. I'll see when that's coming in to try to predict when I could build the full set, or do I just want to build a partial of the demand. And I would kind of write almost notes to myself, this is the quantity I can build. And if there was an issue with that, I would go to the top level planners and I would say, okay guys, we only have this many that we can build. What do you guys want me to prioritize? What's high? And so after I did all of that, I would also have to check the layout statuses. So you can't just slap an assembly on there and hope that it works. It has to be approved. And so it goes through an engineering process, and before it can go through again, it just has to be approved. It can't be in review. And so we work very closely with quality control over this. And essentially at the bottom of each slide, I kind of put what I learned from it, just because I've learned so many things in different areas. So in this particular part, I learned to determine what to build and what can be built through utilizing SAP, the stoppage report, and eFactory. And some of the related coursework that really helped me do this was when I took manufacturing planning and control with Professor Fico. I understood what material resource planning was before I even started working on this. I understood how to level out my production. So you don't want to just build a lot one day, not so much the next day. You want to level out your resources. And again, I learned what a bill of materials is and what an explosion is, and related to scheduling. So the next part of a schedule, after I figured out, okay, here's what I can actually build, I had to ask myself, when should I build it? So there's typically 5 days in the week. Sometimes we would have them work Saturdays if it was really intense. And so I had about 16 hours a day because they served 2 shifts. And I would first decide which builds were hot. So I'd have the upper level planners run up to me and say, Sydney, we have to have this build, the CCA has to be built so that we can finish our top level build. So I would try to fit those in as soon as I possibly could. Then I had to say, okay, So some builds, they are part of the same part. We call them the same part family. So they're similar in setup. Essentially, we don't want to make them keep setting up over and over for like similar assemblies throughout the entire week. So we would group them all together. So again, it minimizes setup time, and then for the kitters as well. So before we have our builds, you have to have your kit put together. And if it's the same parts, they can kit it all together, and it's just a lot easier of a process because kitting can take 5+ hours to do in a week. Once I have all of that kind of put together in my schedule, I try to distribute some of the shorter builds in length. So some of them you can see don't take nearly as long as some of the other ones. So instead of putting like 20 short builds on one day, I would try to distribute them throughout the week so that we weren't doing setups one whole day. And the production people would not be very happy. And that's another thing I really had to keep in mind was that you're working with the production staff. And so you can put something on a schedule, but if they don't like it, sometimes they'll try to do their own thing. And so to make them happy, I try to distribute those across the week and try to minimize the number of setups per day. And then one thing I really took away from this was I learned how to build a schedule based on things like capacity, prioritization, and the different build characteristics of just time. Then finally, once I have my schedule all put together, I have to release all the builds 1 to 2 days prior to when they're actually running. And the reason behind it is it has to go through kitting. So I would release the shop order, which is essentially one order of whatever assembly. They would go forward and say, okay, you can build this many. And sometimes kitting takes 5 or 6 hours, so you can't start kitting on the day you want to build something. It would take almost an entire shift for them to build it together, so that's why you have to release it early. Then once they say, okay, you can build this many of the ones that you want to build, you then have to do PWB prep, so that's printed wiring boards. They have to bake them out in order to remove the moisture so that the boards work correctly. And so that process alone takes 6 to 9 hours as well. So they can't start on the PWB prep until all the shop orders are released, so that means until kitting says it's okay to do so. And then finally, they can produce it, they can set it up, and they can run the assembly. However, there can sometimes be problems, which we saw over the summer. Sometimes builds have to be scrubbed. There's something called a vapor phase. Sometimes it doesn't solder on the parts correctly, and the whole line will stop, and they'll have to communicate that to me for me to have to readjust all of my planning and scheduling and have to fit to their different needs. And so I learned how to convert and release shop orders, order PWBs, and communicate and work with the production floor and kitting as well as the top-level schedulers. And I would say the outcome of this was I had a schedule every single week, and it was a good outcome because otherwise it would have stopped production and that wouldn't have been so great. The next part of my internship, which meets my second learning objective, this continues on with the first thing. This was a little small part, so it's kind of like SMT, but it's called programmable parts. These programmable parts actually went into the circuit card assemblies, but they only have like 2 parts each, so they're not really at jeopardy for missing too many parts. Some of the other builds would have over 100 parts, and if you're missing one part, you can't usually build it unless you have an alternate. So again, I learned how to do programmable parts. You would pull the demand and release, and then communicate that you release the orders. But the second part was the stoppage root cause drop-down menu that I created for them. So one of the things that they tasked me with, they were saying, Sydney, we have a lot of stoppages. We're not sure why. And they're like, could you look at over the historical data and kind of tell us if you see a trend? Well, on the stoppage report, they have a root cause column, and it says, okay, here's the root cause. Half the time it wasn't filled out, and the other half of the time, everybody has their own way of communicating, so it's really hard to quantify when the world's going on. So I kind of addressed this with my supervisor, and I proposed making a menu that they could drop down in the spreadsheet that would then produce a graph that showed the main root causes currently and over time. So the first step I took, which I used my project management knowledge from Professor Fico, so I learned how to do a project charter here, how to use project in order to look at our timeline and how to establish critical paths and everything else. So I definitely applied that here. So I started by building a project charter, I had a timeline, and I proposed it, showed it to them, they liked it. And then the fun part of developing a drop-down menu. So I created a survey, I interviewed a bunch of the different people who would be utilizing it, and I looked at historical data in order to form different menus that they could just drop down and pick. And there was a lot of different root causes after, I think I spent like a month analyzing some of the different ones. But I think one of the main ones that we were seeing a lot was due to allocation, because of everything that's going on, everybody wants the same parts because of the automotive industry, aerospace ramping up, everybody's competing for the same parts. So that seemed to be a common cause, as well as just like POs placed late or supplier quality issues. So this was just, again, something that they could utilize. And I actually implemented it towards the end of my internship, so I don't know exactly. I haven't been able to see a trend because I implemented it in the last month. But I also developed a procedure and training on how to use the root cause job avenue that I established. So I learned how to categorize the root causes and take charge of a continuous improvement opportunity. And again, the outcome was the drop-down menu. And finally, the last part of my internship had to do with their physical inventory, which is a huge process for us to undertake in defense. So one of the things I was tasked with doing was we have some of our inventory is at a vendor, so I had to send out vendor consignment letters detailing what they had or what we think they had. They had to come back and say we have this many in stock, or this is what happened to it, the return date, and then I took all the responses and we developed actions for SAP and other things to follow up on for our physical inventory. I did pre-physical inventory audits, so I went down to the floor, make sure they were dispositioning their waste that they had and scrap, and then I made sure that they had all the barcodes correctly, do not count stickers, all those different things. And then I also actually helped with physical inventory, which was a crazy process. I think I was there till 10 p.m. one night, and then the other night I got to leave early, but they were there till 2 a.m. Reconciling the inventory. It was an all-day, all hands on deck kind of thing, and I really learned how crazy the whole thing is, but it was a cool experience. So I learned the importance of VDCA in relation to physical inventory, the stages of physical inventory, and all the related complications. And so going off of that, we had sometimes people would double scan things, and we would see them pop up. Sometimes we couldn't find items and they were hiding in engineers' desks. We actually went forward and had to pull out people's desks trying to look for expensive assets that they had. So we had some problems and then sometimes we just couldn't find something and it pops up later. And so the outcome of that was, again, I helped with just the VDCA letters and having a good completed physical inventory. And so that was my internship experience at Honeywell. And the overall outcome is I learned it's a lot different than school. It's a lot of hard work and you have to catch on quickly. But I really enjoyed it and I really liked the fast pace of it. And I was always busy and I was always doing something, and I really just enjoyed learning about just all the different roles that everybody plays in supply chain. So if you guys have any questions, that's a great question.
So you're done with your internship now?
I am done.
So that they want you back?
Yes, they offered me a job full-time when I graduated. And I accepted it, so I'm going to be going back.
So when are you going back there? When are you graduating?
I graduate in December. And so they offered me the leadership rotational, so I'll be trying 3 different positions for like I think a year and a half to 2 years. And so I get to try production scheduling again, fulfillment specialist, and then business analytics. So
This is great, you know, like when we're back at Ford or GM, they have the same things, so when they see our potential, you know,
yeah, I was
employee,
really.
they put them on track for leadership. So it's pretty great presentation. Regarding SAP, so you find out there are so many numbers but not accurate in SAP.
Well, sometimes it was pulling from the wrong locations. So we had 2 different types of inventory. We had inventory under $25 and inventory over $25, and so they're stored in different locations. Well, sometimes the system would only look at one location and not the other. So it would say we're missing parts even though we have like over 1,000 in stock. It would just pull from the wrong locations.
Did you get to verify the accuracy of your drop down?
So I actually tested it a lot myself. So I went forward and I did some practice runs with it. And so now that I've implemented it, we'll see. Probably when I come back, I'll get to really look at how often it's used and like to what accuracy. But I did communicate with them and I worked really closely with everyone to make sure that I got their main root causes that they actually actually see.
It's not, yeah, I like the processes you went through.
It was fun because the survey that I did, I didn't get a whole lot of responses, so that's why I actually had to go forward and interview people and like look at the historical data. I even Googled like scholarly articles about it and read different main root causes and different things when I was researching it.
When you look at the historical data, how did you analyze it?
So they have comments in their stoppage column, and so they would say things like, I don't know, like the quality of this was bad, we had to return it, or they would say things like, some things I never even thought about, like maybe the fare wasn't in place, or it would just, I would read their comments and then I would say, okay, does this fit into any of the categories I have here? Can I make it fit, or do I need to make another category? And so I formed new categories, went through the list a couple of times to make sure everything was categorized and could be met. And I made another one for really strange things that like never happened.
That's cool.
But I think the hardest part of this whole internship was doing the scheduling because, like I said, it was trying to meet not only what upper level planners want from you, because they're trying to meet, especially towards the end of the month, they're trying to meet their revenue. So they're like, we need you to do the impossible, we need you to make this happen. But then you also have kitting, who's saying like they can only kit so many things, and you have the production floor and they want it to flow a certain way. And so you're having to take all of these voices and kind of build a schedule that tries to make everybody happy.
I don't recommend you if you go back to become a master production scheduler. Remember back in Detroit, this massive production schedule, they had the highest rate of heart attack. That's simple.
I
So
don't
that
know.
enough, they have to go back chasing parts and everything, especially, to multi-task based, operation.
Well,
The leadership program, they
Oh,
really
you
like
missed from
it. You
Honeywell?
understand everything.
I'm from mom.
Oh, okay.
That's mom.
Congratulations.
I could definitely see how that could give you a heart attack doing that kind of stuff, but I think again, doing the leadership, it's good to see all the different perspectives so that you can lead properly.
You took Six Sigma too?
Mm-hmm.
And lean manufacturing too?
Yeah, manufacturing, planning, and control, and then project management. I think those are the three main classes that really, really helped me.
How about business intelligence?
I haven't taken that yet.
So I want to take that one too.
So that would definitely help with business analytics, the rotation they want me to do there. But they also wanted me, and I don't know if we'd be ever interested in doing this, but they offered to come here and speak as well, and to bring some of the circuit card assemblies and to talk
That
about.
Yeah, it would be great because I wanted to also talk with Dr. Shuaib. He's teaching manufacturing plan and control this term, so you can be a guest speaker there.
Okay. And they also said that there's job openings right now, and they would really like any recent